Good morning. My name is Gigi, and I'm going to talk a little bit about learning to quilt for So Creative. One of the big things in all of my introductory classes that I like to point out is that precision matters. If it says it's going to be a 1/4 of an inch seam, it needs to be a 1/4 of an inch seam. Our quilt that we're going to do is really, it's a bit of a sampler quilt. I'm getting photobombed by a dog or two, sorry about that. And we're going to do half square triangles, and we're going to do 4 patch blocks, and we are going to make a star, and it's a little bit of a modern quilt in that it's not a very symmetrical pattern, but everybody can put it together as they'd like. And the reason why we make all these different parts is because it's very important for the practice points. If, as you make the various size blocks and they come together properly, the whole block will fit together, the whole quilt will fit together, and you won't say, oh, how did I do that? How does this go? It will just all go together nicely. It's all practice. Every quilt is a little bit more practice. There is no perfect. There's no absolute right and wrong. We can make anything work, but there are ways to make them work more easily than others. And so now we'll go on to the first step of our sampler quilt. So for our quilt, there are not too many requirements. As I said, we're going to do 4 patch blocks with strip piecing, and we're going to do half square triangle blocks of multiple sizes. It's not a truly modern quilt because we are putting borders on it. If it were a modern quilt, it would most likely not have borders, but that's a talk for another point in time. We're working on understanding the basics of how to put together easily and quickly. I always recommend that you acquire a good basic Learn to Quilt book, because when you have that, you can refer to it. Also remember that YouTube is your friend, and anything you have a question about, probably somebody else had a question about, and it's already got most likely a video or two that you can say, okay, let me see how to do this, and somebody will have shown how to do it. The book that I've been recommending most recently is by Alex Anderson. It's a good basic introduction to what you need to know about quilting, and it's a good reference to have. I believe the book by Nancy Zeman, which was called, what was it called? Quilt with Confidence, is out of print. I'm not positive about that, but that was my go-to book before, and we were unable to get it anymore, so we found the book by Alex Anderson, which is also a very good book, and it's not a one-trick pony. There's a lot of information there. It's not, this is the quilt that you make with this pattern. These are the blocks, and they can go together in lots of different ways. So for our quilt, we basically need 5 different fabrics. Just a second, and I will get them so that you can see them. Okay, so when we're making a quilt, in addition to precision in stitching and precision in cutting, which are very important, also the colors you choose matter. You need to find colors that you feel go well together and that have some flow to them. If you do all bright colors in the same tones, you might as well just quilt a single piece of fabric, which is fine. A whole cloth quilt is also very nice. But you want some motion. You want to look at the quilt and have your eyes pulled along the different color lines. And you want to have it draw your attention to the features you've put in. In our case, we can make lines with the half square triangles, or we can make lines with our 4 patch blocks. The star can draw your eyes to the center or to the side or wherever you have put your star. But there's a lot of variation, and we are choosing colors that are lights and darks to show off the contrasts. For example, I always advise people to look to find one fabric that jumps out at you and says, this is me, and pulls a contrast that you like. I've just been going through boxes. I found this in one of my boxes. If I were going to use this as sort of my basis upon which I would build my quilt, I would look for a pink that sort of went. I can pull out the pink there. That light blue, to me, it would kind of go, not really necessarily. We've got a bright blue, which again would work. There's yellow, there's orange, there's a bright green. I would look for a collection of 5 colors, some lighter, some darker, if this was my one that spoke to me. That's how I would do with that one. Well, I have this color grouping that Quilt went to a great nephew out of these. If I started with this, say I started with that one that's got greens and yellows and some blues, I can pull out different colors and I can walk through the different colors if that's the one. If I was working with this one, I would look for things that contrasted and coordinated with those. That would probably be one of mine, and then I might go in a different direction. I might do some navies or some grays that go nice. And basically, we're gonna look for 5 colors, and when you go to your quilt shop, at So Creative, we're always happy to help you search for your colors. And it's a case you have to audition things. If this is what I was gonna do, if I was doing a quilt for a little person, this one is great. I can do all sorts of primary colors. I've got reds, I've got blues, I've got some brown, I've got some gray, green, there's some yellows. I can play with whatever colors I want with this to dance across the top and pull your eye around. A fabric like this one is a little bit harder because it's very directional. So unless you want to be extremely careful when you're putting your quilt together to make sure that everything that goes in one direction goes in the same direction, that's fine. But sometimes for your first quilt in particular, it's better to choose something that sort of doesn't matter which way you put it, because this one, when you hold it this way, some letters are right side up, some are upside down. When you hold it this way, again, it's random enough that it can be any way. A fabric like this one, again, it can go in any direction. Directional prints. Let's see if I've got a directional print. At first glance, this looks like it's a directional print, and it is kind of a directional print because the glasses run this way. When you turn it this way, they're all on their sides. If that bothers you, then this is not one you'd want to jump to for your first quilt. There are some times when a directional print doesn't matter, and other times when it jumps out and says, oh no, not so good. This one, again, a print that probably looks better if the fish are swimming one way versus another way. If it were me advising you, I would say let's not use that for your first quilt. Again, this one, you can tell I've been to Hawaii. This one is, again, really kind of directional. You don't want your fish swimming on their heads or swimming straight up and down. Some more prints. This one does have the stripes going one way versus the other. Does it bother you if they tip 2 directions? If it doesn't, then it's fine. But it will be very hard to make them all consistent without having to cut a lot of extra blocks. This giraffe fabric, really, really cute, but very much the giraffe's feet should all be on the same side of the quilt. you really don't want your giraffes upside down. So that would be, again, one that I would probably say not such a good idea. This little bicycling, I guess it's a mouse. No, I guess it's a little woman, I don't know. This little thing on a unicycle is going every which way. So this one wouldn't matter. There is no up or down because sometimes her wheels are down, sometimes her wheels are up. So it wouldn't matter. Floating elephants. All the balloons are up, all the elephants are down. So if you turn it around sideways, they're all on their sides. It's very definitely upside down here. That's what I mean when I say directional prints. It's very much a case that your life will be easier if you avoid a directional print for the first few times you make a quilt. You can handle it. It can be dealt with. It requires a lot of thinking and sometimes a fair amount of unstitching as well as stitching, but that's okay. But I would recommend that you find the piece of fabric that speaks to you, and then you move on from there and find 4 more pieces that work with it, so that you, ideally about 5 different fabrics, and that will do you. You want to go from lights to darks so that you'll have some variation across the top of your quilt top. You don't want it to be just a flat canvas. You want it to have a bit of motion. You want your eye to be pulled different directions through it. So that's why it's important to get multiple colors and, well, or at least multiple shades. So here we go. So these are the 5 different pattern fabrics that I have chosen. Our quilt requires, there's 2 different types of blocks really. There's the 4-patch and there are half square triangles. For me, I decided my 4-patch, I like the way these colors flow together. My 4 patches will be made out of these 2 colors, so they'll offset each other. And then my half square triangles will probably be these 2, but they might be these 2. And then I have a star, and that's made out of and this, I believe this will be the background and this will be the star. I'm doing it a little bit differently than I have in the past. But in terms of materials that are required for our quilt, we need a cutting mat, which is here. If you can invest, this is a 24 by 36 inch one, I believe, and this is perfectly adequate. If you can buy the next size up, it makes life easier, but you can do everything on this. I like the 6.5 inch ruler, 24.5 by 6.5, and then I have a 12.5 inch square ruler. I really think you need those 2 size rulers, make it easiest for you to do what we have to do, and then you need a good rotary cutter with a new blade in it. Don't ever use an old blade. If you find that you're making a cut and it's skipping threads, that means your blade needs to be replaced. If you've gone over a pin, replace your blade. Okay, so when we get our fabric, we're going to bring it home. We've chosen it. We are going to bind the edges. You can zigzag, or if you have a serger, do that along the edges that were cut from the bolt. That's really important. And then we're going to toss it all in the washer. We're going to toss it in the dryer. We're going to get any extra color washed out. We're going to get any shrinkage taken care of. And then we're going to make sure we folded it properly. Because remember when you went to elementary school and you did paper weaving and it's over, under, over, under, over, under? That's how fabric's woven too. And we want all of our things to be straight of grain. We want to have our threads lined up so they're running straight so we don't have any unnecessary stretch. Now, if I match the cut edges with cut edges, I don't know if you can see there, that's a cut edge, and that's a cut edge. And if I hang it like this, there are wrinkles that go diagonally down near the fold. This maybe, I'm not sure if we can show it effectively, but the best way to do it to get your fabric squared is to match the selvages, and then you just slide the selvages one way or the other until the folds, those diagonal wrinkles towards the fold, disappear. And once they've disappeared, you've got your threads running straight. That's why we run it through the laundry, so that we can see where they are. And then when that's done, you can see that my cut edges do not line up perfectly, and that's okay, because my threads are lining up perfectly. So that's one side, and this is the other side, the back side. So I will end up trimming those uneven edges off, but I want my fold to be perpendicular to my threads. And if I slide my selvages the other way for demonstration purposes, can you see that big diagonal? And I can't shake that out because my threads don't line up. I can't get a nice smooth fold because my threads don't line up. So we want to wash all our fabric, toss it in the dryer, get any shrinkage done before we spend time making a quilt, and get any colors that's going to wash out before we spend time in making a quilt. And then we're sliding our selvages so that our fabric hangs nice and square, and it doesn't matter where our edges, whether they line up, the cut edges line up, because when the fabric is made, they starch it and they put it on the bolt, and it looks beautiful. And it looks like it's perfectly square, but we put it in the wash to relax it so it can go to the shape that it wants to be. Then we're gonna go to the iron. And when we iron, my iron is not plugged in, just so nobody's worried about it. But we're not gonna iron by pushing and shoving. You can slide it gently, but we're pressing. Truly the word is pressing rather than ironing. We wanna gently move the iron over, not work to get things out. There is a product that works really well if you have a lot of wrinkles. It's called Best Press. We carry it at So Creative, absolutely, and it's available at any reputable quilt store too, and probably other places. But it's not a heavy starch, but it's a stiffener and a flattener, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's a good trick to have in your collection. So I'm gonna go take this off I have a larger ironing board, which is much easier to work at. I'm gonna get all of mine ironed, pressed, smooth, and I'll be back shortly. Okay, so we've got our fabric. We've washed it, we've pressed it, we've got it nice folded, and I didn't do a good job ironing this. But what we're doing now is we're putting it on our cutting mat. And we're trying to line up the selvages with one of the straight lines on our cutting mat or the fold, your kind of choice. My table's not quite wide enough, but I think it'll support it. Then I'm going to take my ruler, and rulers have all these lines across, and what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure I have a straight line. In this case, it's either the 2-inch or the 22.5 inch. And I'm going to line that little line up with the fold all the way across, and I'm sliding it as far to the right as I can to shave off the least amount of fabric, because it's always better not to waste fabric. But this is a case where it's important not to just say, oh, I can't cut that, because it's important to have straight of grain. Then I'm going to release the guard on my cutter, which is a push in and pull down. Now I have that very sharp blade, and I'm never going to touch that blade, and I'm never going to leave my cutter without the blade holder in place. They're very sharp, they're very dangerous, and there are some that are designed so that the cover goes back into place automatically. If you have a habit of if you can't automatically close your blade, look into paying a little bit more and getting a safer blade for you, because it's a very important thing. Blades should never be left open lying around. So, and then I'm going to hold my ruler, and we recommend the Creative Grids rulers because on the back side of a Creative Grids ruler, let's see if you can see all these little dots here, are grippy, so that when you push down, that ruler, if I put it down this way, the ruler would slide all over the place. When I put it down with the numbers facing up, all those little sort of translucent dots grab the fabric and keep it from sliding. And this ruler has them too. There's a row of them there, there's a row there. They're around it. So again, I'm going to hold my ruler with one hand. I'm going to open my cutter. I'm going to push the cutter upright. I don't want it like this. I don't want it like that. I want it running perpendicular to my ruler, and I'm going to cut right along the edge of my ruler. And sometimes I have to walk my fingers as I go on the ruler so it doesn't slide. And I'm going to keep my cutter butted up against the ruler the whole way across. And sometimes it takes a little while to go slowly across. And I'm going to close my cutter. Then I'm going to lift my piece up and make sure it comes off. One of the key things is if your blade is not sharp, when you go to take that little piece you cut off, it doesn't come loose because your blade isn't sharp anymore. And so you got to go back and forth and get a new blade. There are a few things in quilting that are really important. Fresh needles, replace your needle often. It's a very cheap form of insurance, and a good blade. Now, for our quilt, we're going to be doing different strips. And so there are ways of cutting, one of which is you can use the lines on your rulers. And I, at this point, always recommend, without touching your fabric, if you're right-handed, spin your cutting pad around. And then you can use the lines on, if you're cutting a strip with a 1/2 inch mark. See the black numbers on these go from 0, 1.5, this is an implied 1/2 inch, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. If you're cutting something that's a full inch width, if you look at the white numbers from right to left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the implied 6, and that's 6.5. For our quilt, we need to cut 5-inch strips, 5 1/4 inch strips, and 9-inch strips, as well as for the borders, we're going to cut some 1.5 inch strips and some 5.5 inch strips. So I like to encourage people to, let's see, our first one, we're going to do 5-inch strips. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to find the number 5, and I'm going to butt that strip, that line, 5 inches, right along the cut edge of my fabric. And sometimes it's a little bit off. See here, I think you can see, well, so I have to spend a little bit of time being careful and lining that number right up all the way, top to bottom. Then again, I put my hand on the ruler, take the guard off the ruler, the cutter is straight up and down, and I go all the way to the other side. And I have a 5-inch strip. And we're going to be cutting that 5-inch strip down. I'm going to slide this away carefully because this is all nicely lined up. So we're going to be cutting this 5-inch strip down into different sizes. We're going to make, first we're making 5-inch strips. We're going to need a 5 1/4 inch strip, which is done the same way, except that when you do the 5 1/4 inch strip, you're going to line, instead of lining up for 5 inches, you go for 5 1/4, which on this one you have these nice white dashed lines that run at the quarter. And so there's that, 5 1/4. But one of our strips, or a couple of our strips that we're going to do out of 2 of our colors are going to be 9-inch strips. And because this is not a 9-inch wide ruler, we're going to do that a little bit differently. There are 2 ways to do it. You can use 2 rulers together. So this is 6.5. So you can say, okay, to get 9.5, this takes math. You got to be careful. But 6.5 and 2.5 will give you 9 inches, I believe. Last time I checked. So we would go here. So this is running on the 2.5 inch line, and this is 6.5 inches. And so there we have a 9-inch strip. There's another way to do a 9-inch strip. If you only have one ruler and a square, one of the easiest ways is to take your square and swivel it so you've got your black numbers, and you want 2.5 inches. And you can kind of center it along your long ruler, and you can hold the long ruler and slide this to this side, and it's at 2.5 inches there, and slide it to this side, which I can't go any further because I have a tripod there, and I'll bump the camera, but that would give me a 9-inch. So I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm going to cut my 6.5 and 2.5 inch strip, and I'm going to hold my blade right straight up and go from one side all the way to the other. And it's important, close your blade when you're done, keep your cutter vertical, don't angle it, and go all the way holding against your ruler. You don't want to veer off at the end. That's very common that people get to the end of their ruler and then they go off like that. And they go off like that, there. And then their strips aren't the same width the whole time. So what I recommend in my class is that spend a little time, practice your cutting, practice being consistent. If you need 1-inch strips, they've got to be 1 inch the whole length. If you don't have a good mat, or if you have a smaller mat, you can always take your strips or your fabric and fold it back on itself. You've got your one straight edge here, so you can line that up and make sure that your cut edges match perfectly. And then you are able to cut. If you know that your cutting pad has accurate measurements and you need a 2-inch strip, you can say, okay, 16, 14, that's 2 inches there. Then you line this up along the lines on the pad. However, spend a little time and measure your pad, because some pads have lots of numbers on them, but they're not always accurate. So that's my 9-inch strip, but I want a 2-inch strip. So I've got 2 inches now that I've lined up. I'm showing you different ways to do this because there is no one way that's always the best way. It's always good to have an arsenal of tricks. So there's a 2-inch strip. And say I wanted a 2.5-inch strip. The other way to do it would be to say, okay, there's that 2.5-inch mark. I'm going to line the 2.5-inch mark there against the cut edge. I'm going to make it run straight top to bottom. Then I'm going to take my long ruler, and this ruler is practically big enough to do that folded piece, but you don't always have, sometimes you've got only a shorter ruler, but it's good to know. So I've measured out my 2.5. I've got the 2.5-inch line right on the cut edge of my fabric. So then I hold this ruler in place and slide this one out of the way, holding my thing upright. And then I've cut off my 2.5-inch strip. Closing my blade, setting my cutter down. Practice so you're comfortable. We are going to need 5-inch strips, 5.25-inch strips, and 9-inch strips. And we're going to have some sub-cutting too. And then things are generally, this quilt that we're doing is forgiving. There are built-in allowances. Okay, so we've got our fabric. We've washed it, we've pressed it, we've got it nice folded, and I didn't do a good job ironing this. But what we're doing now is we're putting it on our cutting mat. And we're trying to line up the selvages with one of the straight lines on our cutting mat or the fold, your kind of choice. My table's not quite wide enough, but I think it'll support it. Then I'm going to take my ruler, and rulers have all these lines across, and what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure I have a straight line. In this case, it's either the 2-inch or the 22.5-inch. And I'm going to line that little line up with the fold all the way across, and I'm sliding it as far to the right as I can to shave off the least amount of fabric, because it's always better not to waste fabric. But this is a case where it's important not to just say, oh, I can't cut that, because it's important to have straight of grain. Then I'm going to release the guard on my cutter, which is a push in and pull down. Now I have that very sharp blade, and I'm never going to touch that blade, and I'm never going to leave my cutter without the blade holder in place. They're very sharp, they're very dangerous. And there are some that are designed so that the cover goes back into place automatically. If you have a habit of if you can't automatically close your blade, look into paying a little bit more and getting a safer blade for you, because it's a very important thing. Blades should never be left open lying around. So, and then I'm going to hold my ruler, and we recommend the Creative Grids rulers because on the back side of a Creative Grids ruler, let's see if you can see, all these little dots here are grippy, so that when you push down, that ruler, if I put it down this way, the ruler would slide all over the place. When I put it down with the numbers facing up, all those little sort of translucent dots grab the fabric and keep it from sliding. And this ruler has them too. There's a row of them there, there's a row there. They're around it. So again, I'm going to hold my ruler with one hand. I'm going to open my cutter. I'm going to push the cutter upright. I don't want it like this. I don't want it like that. I want it running perpendicular to my ruler. And I'm going to cut right along the edge of my ruler. And sometimes I have to walk my fingers as I go on the ruler so it doesn't slide. And I'm going to keep my cutter butted up against the ruler the whole way across. And sometimes it takes a little while to go slowly across. And then I'm going to close my cutter. And then I'm going to lift my piece up and make sure it comes off. One of the key things is if your blade is not sharp, when you go to take that little piece you cut off, it doesn't come loose because your blade isn't sharp anymore. And so you got to go back and forth and get a new blade. There are a few things in quilting that are really important. Fresh needles, replace your needle often. It's a very cheap form of insurance, and a good blade. Now, for our quilt, we're going to be doing different strips. And so there are ways of cutting, one of which is you can use the lines on your rulers. And I, at this point, always recommend, without touching your fabric, if you're right-handed, spin your cutting pad around. And then you can use the lines on, if you're cutting a strip with a 1/2 inch mark. See the black numbers on these go from 0, 1.5, this is an implied 1/2 inch, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. If you're cutting something that's a full inch width, if you look at the white numbers from right to left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the implied 6, and that's 6.5. So this is the first of my 2 4-patch colors. So I'm just going to start cutting. I need 5-inch strips. So I'm going to even off my edge, slide my ruler straight over, and my ruler moved because I didn't move my hand carefully. So let's see. We're going to start again. Okay, and I will cut, and I will be back and join you in a bit. Note that now is the only time I'm starting to trim off selvages occasionally. And now I need 4 1/4 inch squares. So this will be 2 cuts. Oops. That's why I don't really like that method. I do better with my rulers. So if we're going to quilt, some of the key things that we need pins, although a lot of people don't use them very often, but they're good to have. A good quality all-purpose thread. I recommend polyester. I want my seams to stay together. Some people, there are arguments for all cotton. I don't think that's necessary. My first quilting teacher did not suggest that it was necessary, and I've stuck with that. You want a good neutral color. It doesn't have to match your things perfectly because the seams aren't going to be exposed. Even the best of us, all of us, always have to take stitches out as well as put stitches in. So a good seam ripper is important. This one has two different sized ones, one that's really much too big and one that's suitable. This is a good short distance, like when you're testing your seams to see if they're 1/4 of an inch, this one will tell you the edge of the fabric goes there, this rides on the seam. And if you find out that when you measure your seam, if it's like that, it's definitely not a 1/4 of an inch. So before you start stitching your pieces together, you do need to practice your seams and measure. It's important to have some sort of a marking implement. For a lot of our marking initially, it's not going to show, so you can actually use a pencil when what you're marking is going to end up in the seam allowance. A pencil is perfectly fine. When you're going to have to get your marking off. There's some really wonderful chalk that disappears with heat. There's some things that disappear in the air, some that disappear with water. There are many, many choices. I kind of like this chalk roller pen, and I have white, but that works okay because I'm going to be using it on a dark fabric. So if you have a light fabric, the white might not be as good. So there are many different colors available. So that's the starting of sort of key sewing notions. And then we are going to go on and start doing our strip piecing. I always recommend that before you start doing any of your actual construction, take some scraps, stitch along. I have my 1/4" foot on my machine, and I'm just practicing to make sure that when I stitch, it's at 1/4 inch. And so I will take my measure and I line that up over the threads, and this is set at the 1/4 inch there. So when the light green is on the threads, the dark green is at the edge of the fabric. So running my fabric along the edge of my 1/4 inch foot is giving me a true 1/4 inch seam. And see, I have light gray on an off-white, but when I open it up, you really don't see, because you're not supposed to see the stitches. So that is all set and ready to go. When we are making our 4-patch, we're going to be using strip piecing. And to strip piece, you want to put the right sides of your fabric together, and I have batiks. And my theory on batiks is that while there may be a right side or a wrong side, if I cannot see the difference between the two sides of the batiks, then it doesn't really matter. As long as I can't tell a difference, I'll be fine with it. So what I do is I want to take the selvage edges, and I'm going to match them together, and I'm matching the cut sides together too. And so therefore the raw edges are running even. And I'm going to put them under my presser foot. And because we're doing strip piecing, there is no need to do a back stitch. If you're concerned about your stitches coming out, shorten your stitch length to about a 2 millimeter, because we're going to be cutting things apart and putting them back together again. If you do a back stitch, you're probably going to be cutting it off, so it's unnecessary for this stage. So I'm running this along. I'm going to sew from one end of the strip to the other, and I'm going to do, I have, I believe, 4 strips of each, light and dark, and I'm going to sew them all together, and then we'll be back. For our half square triangles, we have to take our squares that we cut, and we're going to mark them point to point across one diagonal. And we're going to do that for each of our, you decide whether you're marking all the lights or all the darks. You want to mark the back side, not the front side. So I'll get these all marked, and then I'll be back. So now we're going to take each of the squares, the light squares, and we're going to take the dark squares that we've just drawn our lines on. We're going to line up the raw edges that we've cut so that they're pretty much even on all four sides. Then what we're going to do, and if you want to put a pin to hold them in place, that's fine. We are going to sew 1/4 of an inch from each side of that line that we just drew. So we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch down this side and 1/4 of an inch down that side. And we're going to go through all of our blocks. And after that, we will come back to the next step. So we're going to sew, turn on the machine. We're going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of the line we just drew. So put our foot down and away we go. And when we're sewing, we're always careful. We're just allowing our fabric to be pulled through by the machine. We're not pushing or pulling, we're just stitching. So you can see, I think, that we've got 2 rows of stitching, one on each side of our center line that we drew. So I'm going to finish stitching all of those together, and then I'll be back. Okay, that's the end of all the half square triangles stitched together. And now we're going to move on to the next step. And on all these half square triangles, we drew a line from corner to corner. And it doesn't matter so much if we actually cut on the line as long as we cut from corner to corner. And let's get this a little bit so it's a little bit more in so you can see the whole thing. So again, corner to corner, blade released, blade straight up against the ruler, right straight down, smack dab in the middle. And then from each pair, we have one half square triangle, two half square triangles. So we're going to do that with all of them. And then after we've got them all cut into two half square triangles, I'm going to take them to the ironing board. But okay, after we've cut them apart, and we're going to think about ironing. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the seam. So we take my iron is not hot. I'm just doing it for demonstrations. Never iron on your cutting board. Never put your hand on the bottom of an iron, but it's not plugged in, so it's not hot. So first you set the seam. You press along the seam. Then you take it and you're lifting the dark side up because we want to press our seams towards the dark side. And so we're going to lift the dark side up and then we're going to push gently against the seam. And what that does is it opens the seam out fully and it pushes it towards the dark side. So it will be all neatly pressed towards the dark side. I am going to go do that with our strips. We're going to do much the same thing. The strip sets we made. First we're going to set the seam, then we're going to press along the length, and we're going to go gently pushing so our seam allowances go towards the dark side. And we're going to end up with 4 great big long pairs of strips sewn together down the middle with all the seam allowances pressed neatly towards the dark side. So I am now going to go to my main ironing board and do that, and I shall return shortly. We also have our strip sets that we've now pressed, we've stitched, we've set the stitch, we've pressed open, the seam, the allowance is going to the dark. So now we're coming back over here to our cutting board, and we're going to be cutting them down from strip sets into rectangles. The first thing we want to do is we're going to very carefully run one of our straight lines of our ruler along our seam line, and we're going to trim off the selvages. That's really important. We don't want the selvages showing up in our finished quilt. Just like when we did the squares, the 9-inch squares, we trim the selvages. Before we start trimming down our strip sets, we're going to trim off the selvages. So they're trimmed off. So we want to make, remember we had 5-inch strips, so now we want to make 5-inch rectangles. So the easiest way to do that is to take our extra and swing it off. I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, this would all be done on the opposite side, and I'm not going to try to demonstrate it that way because that would be downright foolish. I'd probably slice my hand open. But everything would be reversed if you're left-handed. It's not rocket science, it's just done differently. And if you are left-handed, make sure that if you don't buy a universal handed cutter, this can go either way. There are some that are specifically right-handed, and there are some that are left-handed. They're much harder to find. But you can get the universal ones, but in general, the fancy ones that close themselves tend to come in left and right. The universal ones, you have to make sure you actively close your blade cover. So I have my 5-inch mark lined along the edge of my fabric. I have, in this case, it's the 13-inch mark running on the seam line down the middle. So I'm going to cut with my blade vertical, right straight across. And there's one. And I'm gonna move that cord so that it doesn't accidentally get my iron cord trimmed. And I'm going to do this for all of my strip sets. They're all going to be cut into rectangles. I'm not going to make you watch them all, but I'm going to cut two 2 rectangles and then discuss. And if somebody saw, I wasn't holding the ruler carefully, so it shifted a little bit. So now the next stage, after we've cut all of our long strip sets into 5-inch by 10-inch, well, slightly under 10 inches, be 9.5 rectangles. What we're going to do is we're going to take one of each, and we're not going to sew them together this way because that would be putting the same things together. We're going to take them and we're going to sew them this way with the dark and the light. And if you look, I think you can see that, see our seam allowances go in often opposite directions. So we can tell, we can slide them together, and we want to butt those seam allowances right together so that when we've stitched, we have a nice seam where all the corners come together. And if you use your fingers, you can feel if they're not quite close together. Again, you can look and see and say, oh dear, there's a gap there. This seam is here, that seam's there. So when they're like this, we're going to take them, we're going to slide them, and you can tell by the thickness. You can tell as soon as they've nested nicely, with one seam allowance pointing one way and one pointing the other way. And this is a case where sometimes it's very handy to put a pin right in the seam allowance, or right in the seam. See, it goes through one side, it's in the seam, and the other side, it's in the seam. Then I'm going to go here and I'm going to make sure my raw edges are even. And over here, make sure my raw edges are actually even, because right now they're not. I'm going to bring that up. And then I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch down all the way, always pulling my pin out before I stitch through that. I will wait till I get just about there. I will slow down, but I will do it very, very carefully. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine now, and I'm going to cut my strips into 5-inch rectangles, and then I'm going to sew them into blocks, and then I'll be back. See how I did. I'm not bad. I don't know if you can, here we go. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. And for me, I'm okay with not perfect. If you're not okay with not perfect, then you'll want to do it again. See if there we go. Again, just about perfect. Good enough. Okay, now we have our smaller squares that are going to be part of our star, and we're going to do the same thing. We have really small ones that we're leaving out, but our medium-sized light and dark, we're going to be matching them together, sewing along each side, making more half-square triangles. Okay, for the star, we're going to do the same thing. We've got 4 smaller squares. We're going to do the exact same thing to make half-square triangles for our star. So we're going to sew 1/4 inch each side of that line we drew from point to point. Then we're going to go over to the cutting board, and we're going to cut along that line and create from each pair of squares, we're going to create 2 half-square triangles. Okay, this is the part where we start to make the magic happen, where we take a bunch of blocks, some of which we've turned into different shape blocks, and we're going to turn them into a quilt where all the corners match. If you remember, these were the squares that we cut at 4¼ inches. Yes, 4¼ inches. This is our sort of baseline. That's what our finished squares are going to be as we trim down the half square triangles we made for the star. This is an 8-inch square. This is going to be our center. And we're going to have, these are our corner blocks here. And so what has to happen is that these pieces, which right now absolutely do not fit in that little slot that's available to them. Oops, let's see. They don't fit in that little slot because see how far they hang over. These have to be trimmed down so that they're also 4¼ inches. If you've noticed consistently, I have had you oversize things because it's much easier to trim down what is too big than to make grow what is too small. So we have our center square, we have our corner blocks. We're going to set them out of the way again for a minute. And we're going to take our half square triangles. Now you can use your ruler to do this. You've got a 45-degree angle. You want to make sure that 45-degree angle goes right on where the two seams join. Let's see if I can blow that up a little bit. It's also possible, so first you're going to put that, with that running there, you're going to trim these edges because we know we want a 4¼ inch finished size. We know this is bigger because it's 4 3/4, so we easily can trim those off. You can also use your square to do the same thing. Your square has a diagonal line, which is hard to see because we're looking through multiple things. But because this is smaller, I'm going to use that because it's a little bit easier. Now I just have to find my trimmer. So first what I will do is I'll trim off these two sides and make them nice and square on the ruler. There's one. And this is one where it's really good if you're left-handed, but I'm not, so I'm going to have to turn it. And I think I'm going to go with my square because that fits my around all of the stuff here more easily. So we did that side, now we're going to do this side. So we're going to run our 45-degree angle line right on that middle seam. Am I still? Yes. And we're going to slide it right up so that edge we've cut is butted up against the edge of the ruler. And so, oops, except that is folded under. So we're going to start again, make sure all the things are lying flat, which that one wasn't. So we're sliding our 45-degree line right on that seam, cut edge even to the cut edge of the ruler, 45-degree going right down the center of that block on that seam. Okay, now, yes, you can kind of see, let's see, there. Now I'm going to cut this edge to match that edge. And again, looking here, I'm at 4 3/4 and 4 3/4. My finished size for cutting is going to be 4 1/4, so it's okay to trim that off. If you're very in something that's very precise and doesn't give you much extra, you might just be shaving off a couple threads. So now we've got these two sides cut, so we're going to spin this so that the two uncut sides are facing out. We're going to put that seam again right on that 45-degree line, right down that 45-degree line there. Now this time we're going to slide the ruler this way, and there's their 4 1/4 line, that white dashed line, and then the white dashed line here is 4 1/4. So we've got our diagonal line, 45-degree line running right on the seam, 4 1/4, 4 1/4, 4 1/4. So now we're ready to trim this edge and that edge both. There's one, there's two. And now what we should have is a 4 1/4 inch square, which should be just the same size as this 4 1/4 inch square. And look at that, they line up perfectly. So I'm going to finish trimming. Let me do another one. Then we're going to start with our 45 degree. We want to make sure we're over 4 1/4 because that's our trim down size on what's inside. And I always like to trim off the lesser amount first and then do more the second time, just because it's a whole lot easier to trim off than to add on. So I'm going to trim 2 sides. Spin it around and trim the other 2 sides. But this time, again, I'm lining everything up at 4 1/4, 4 1/4, 45 degrees. We're not quite on that. Let's get that situated properly. Okay. And I have 8 of these half square triangles that I'm going to do. But what's going to happen is I'll get them all trimmed. We're going to look back at our piece here. So these are going to be the points of our star. And see how now they're a little bit closer. They still aren't perfectly there because they have to be sewn together. But when we sew these together here, then they will go and be the side there, and then we'll have our corner blocks. And we'll do this on for all 4. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to do all my star point trimming and I'll be back. So now we've got all our things nicely trimmed. Here's our center of our star. We're going to lay them out. And this, sometimes you sit here and say, this doesn't make sense, but it does, because we've got points and they point out and away. And that one will be there. And this one will be there. And that one will be there. That one will be there. So that's how our star points go, and here are our corner blocks. And this is basically a mini quilt top. When we're done sewing all of these together with a 1/4 inch seam, we will sew in rows. We will do this row. We will do this row. We will sew this one to this one to this one, these 2 to this side, these 2 to that side. Then we will have 1, 2, 3 rows. And when we have our 3 rows, we will press them each independently, and then we will sew this row onto the top of the middle part and this row onto the bottom. And ideally, we should find that all of our seams, these seams should match with these seams, should match with these seams. These seams don't have to match, nor do those. But when you sew this piece on, you should end up with the raw edges running even, because you've done everything, you've cut precisely, and you've stitched precisely. And it should go together, and this is why, even though the star, a lot of people have difficulty because the star tends to be in the sample quilt, the star is off center. But the star is very important because the star is your first practice at putting blocks together and making them all come together like they were meant to be together. So I will go off, I will stitch my rows, and I will come back and lay out my 3 rows. So you can see as I'm hitching the 2 sides of the star to the center, my raw edges are even. My seam is here in the center, the raw edges on the side are even. So then I'm just going to stitch across. And there's my points on one side, and then I'll put my points on the other side. Again, the raw edges are all even. And there's my center row ready to be pressed. So here's my top row, and you can go from one side to the other. I'm going from left to right. I put this one over on top of this one. Again, all raw edges even. Then I'm going to start stitching, 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I open it up, that point's on, this point gets flipped over, raw edges all lined up. Points, corner block, and I pulled out my thread. That's not fun, but we will start again. And because we've been very careful about our cutting and our stitching, when I get my 3 rows made, I can slide them together and see that the raw edges on the outside are all the same distance apart, and so it's going to be easy to match the seams. And those are the ones that matter. That seam is irrelevant. It's there, but it will turn out in the center. If these seams nest, then everything else will be fine. So I'm about to assemble my star. Okay, we will try again. I've rethreaded the needle. I've got my seams nicely nested. I've got my foot already down, so I'm just going to slide this up against the edge. I've got my raw edges running against each other. Okay. Those are nesting nicely. I'm going to hold them snug together. Seams going the right ways. Now I've got that one, so now I'm coming down here to worry about making sure this one's properly nested also. And making these raw edges even. One, and that corners came out nice and even. There's the top of my star, and now I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure that you put the base of your star points against the thing, because if you put it this way, your star looks kind of funny. So you want to make sure you match the correct sides together. Again, I'm making sure my seams are nicely nested here. Raw edges even, stitching along at 1/4 inch. I've got that one going, so now I'm all focused on getting this one properly nested so that as I go across the side of the star, I don't have to worry. So I've got my nested seam held together, keeping my raw edges. There we have a star, and again that corner's even, so it just needs to be pressed. So once you've made your star, for all intents and purposes, you have made a quilt top. You have made half square triangles, you have pieced them together, you've made the corners match. This is a mini quilt top. And that means you're all set to take the other blocks you've made. Okay, now that we have finished all of our blocks, what we need to do is first measure. And we know that our finished block size is actually, the final block size before we start assembling them is going to be an 8-inch block. That's our unit because that was the block in the center of our star. So because I had you oversize your blocks to make it easier to practice your trimming, see, as you can see, this is a 9.5 inch when it's all finished. So it's much larger than we want, but it's very good for us because we really need to practice squaring up and how we want our blocks to be. So we know that we want our blocks to be trimmed down to be 8 inches. So with a 4-patch, it's really easy. That means we want 4 inches to this side of that center point, 4 inches here, 4 inches there, and 4 inches here. So we can put that 4 mark right smack dab in the center, lining up our straight 4-inch lines on our seams, and then I'll trim 2 sides, spin it around and trim the other 2 sides. Is this a little bit wasteful? Yes. Is it very good practice to be able to get a handle on centering your blocks, trimming your blocks? Yes. That is why our blocks are bigger than they need to be, because it's good for us. So I'm going to start trimming and I'll be back. Now, if you were squaring up, say, a 9-patch block, it's not as simple because you won't have a seam right down through the center. Instead, you'll have, let's make pretend. It will be like this. You'll have 3 blocks instead of 4. So we'll put this like there. Just pretend. And then you'll have another row here. So what you can do is you can either measure your center block, because you're going to have stitching all around, and you can measure your center block and determine a midpoint. You can eyeball a midpoint, but the same thing goes. You're going to want to be running from that corner there to this corner down here, and then everything that's outside is what gets trimmed. And if, again, you slide your diagonal line along, that's your straight point, is that diagonal there. Like I said, a 4-patch is really nice because we know we want an 8-inch. We know we line up with our seams, but it's the same principle as you get to bigger blocks. And then you say, well, what do I do on the half squares? Because I can't line up the 4-inch with the middle, can I? So let me finish this one. Grab a half square triangle. And so what happens with the half square triangles is they very nicely have that seam along the middle. And we did already work with this on our stars. So because this time we know instead of a 4 1/4 inch, we want an 8-inch, we're going to do the least amount first because it's easier to trim off more later. We got our diagonal running perfectly along that seam, which runs on the diagonal. We're making sure our outside edges are square. We know we want a finished 8-inch square, so we're over 8 inches and over 8 inches, so we know we're safe. So we can trim these 2 sides. Then we can spin our triangle around and do the sides that we didn't get to. And again, our diagonal, our 45-degree line goes perfectly on our seam. And we're lining up 8-inch because we want a finished cut 8-inch square that's going to, our finished square. There's a term in quilting called your finished dimension, and that's post seam allowances. So we want an 8-inch square, which will get us to a 7.5-inch finished block. So we're trimming down, our finished trim size is 8 inches, because that is our unit that we're working with on our quilt. And there we have our half square triangle is at 8 inches. And amazingly enough, If we stack our 4-patch directly on top, they're just the same size. So especially if we swing it so it's running, line up our raw edges. It's like working, again, think back to kindergarten when you worked with unit blocks, and 2 squares equal a rectangle, 2 rectangles, small rectangles equal a larger rectangle, and so on and so forth. And that's what we're doing with our quilt block. If all our blocks are the same size, then we can make our quilt top just like we put that star together. They will all, once we do our stitching, they will all fit perfectly and we will be all set. So I'm going to do a lot more trimming and then we'll get back for some layout. We have our half square triangles and we have our 4 patches. So there's a 4-patch. And what we're going to do now is we're going to lay them out and figure out our final layout. This step of the way, it's really important to have your camera, your phone with you, because it's a whole lot easier to snap a picture and say, do I like that? Let me rearrange them. And remember, you don't have to remember where was it? How did I have it? You can go back and look through your pictures. Cell phones are fantastic things for this. So, I'm not sure where I'm going to lay them out because my design wall hasn't yet appeared out of a box. So I will be back with a spot that's suitable for laying these out to look at, and then we can figure out our final placement. Okay, because I don't have a design wall yet, it's in a box, I'll find it. I have laid these out on the top of a bed. At the moment, they're just laid out, but you can see I have the light greens going in lines, the dark greens going in lines, the deeper half triangles going there together. This is one pattern that one can make. And there is my star. It is not in the center. It's not a centered quilt. It's slightly off center, and that's okay. But you can see there is motion. You can see the dark green leading through of the half square triangles. You can also here see the light leading and outlining this to the star. And the background of the star is the same as part of the 4-patch. That is one pattern. I'm going to take a minute and rearrange them and show you a different pattern. But when you lay out your blocks, snap a picture so that you can remember how you had them in case you don't like the next one and you can't remember where you were. Just a moment and I'll be back with something different. So this is a very different effect using all the blocks that I made. This one is a square arrangement and it's still all the blocks. There's motion. You can see the big lines going up and down. There's my star. And then the smaller lines, you've got a lot of activity amongst the 4 patches. So this is a perfectly acceptable way to arrange your blocks. It's not the way I'm going to choose to make mine go, because to me, I don't find it as pleasing. It's a little bit too stark, but that doesn't mean it's not somebody else's pattern. That's the joy of this quilt, is that once you get your blocks made, you can put them together however you'd like. So again, one should take a picture and save it so that you can consider things later. And I here have one more round of different arranging of the blocks. Again, you've got strong lines pulling by the half square triangles put together in this pattern. And I might try it one more time with the lights together and the darks apart, I'm not sure. But again, this is a square layout, uses all of the blocks I made. If I do a rectangular layout, I have one extra block left over, and that's okay. But again, you've got strong lines, and I might flip the 4-patch going the other way, but I don't think so. I'm okay with that. But I think the bright bold lines are a little bit too strong in this for me. I think I'm happier with seeing the half square triangles rather than the lines, but that's me. Okay, one more, again, very simple change. I flipped the half square triangles around, so now that I have big white, or the grunge off-white lines. Again, all the same blocks, just a different layout. So you play with them for a while. You snap a picture, you take it, you think about it, you decide how you want your blocks laid out. I'm probably going to go back to the one that I did initially where they're all on diagonals and the half square triangles alternate between the dark points facing each other and the light points facing each other. And here's a square layout, very similar to what we started with, but I used that last block, so we squared it off. It's 6 blocks by 6 blocks. The half square triangles alternate whether they point to, the dark sides point to each other or the light sides point to each other. Our star is basically in the middle, which you can do. You don't have to. The quilt in the store is a rectangle and it's not in the middle. So, but there we are.